we haven't made that much progress in terms of reducing poverty when you take a 40-year span. What about inequality? We're just about the most unequal country in the industrialized world in terms of income inequality. We are the most unequal country in terms of wealth inequality. And we have a huge gap when it comes to wage inequality. Back at the time of the Kerner Commission in the 60s, CEOs made 40 times as much as their workers. Today they make 275 times as much as their workers. And it seems to take an AIG kind of media flurry to remind people of that huge gap and those inequalities in terms of wages. That's certainly related to unemployment, which is, of course, going up and is linked in turn to poverty for the nation as a whole. But over the 40 years since the Kerner Commission, the historical gap, 2-to-1 gap between African American and white unemployment has been maintained all through those years across Republican and Democratic presidents. African American rate is always twice as high. Today, a 19-year-old high school dropout, an African American man in a city, now people in that status have an unemployment rate of over 62%, and that is growing. So we haven't made much progress in many ways in terms of employment and race. When it comes to racial injustice, we made progress in terms of school desegregation, for example, after the Kerner Commission. But when it came to the Reagan years, that was reversed, and the 2007 Seattle Supreme Court decision effectively stopped all school desegregation opportunities, and certainly our neighborhoods are still highly segregated. In terms of media diversity, well, we do have the internet, and there's some potential there as long as Comcast doesn't control the media content too much. But there are only 5 or 6 or 7 giant companies controlled by whites who have control of almost all of the media, and the amount of minority ownership of the media is minuscule. And if you take a look at a press conference, there's President Obama standing there, but how many of the people in the audience are African American and Latino or Native American? There's huge disparities there, and they remain maintained to this day. So there hasn't been much progress made in many areas. All of the ones I suggested, one can say that the experience, the trends are not positive, and in many cases negative. Now, certainly there are counter trends. There are good things that have happened in the last 40 years. The African American and Latino middle class has expanded dramatically as African American and Latino entrepreneurship, and the number of African Americans and Latinos who are locally elected officials, of course, is skyrocketed. And the best story is, of course, that we actually did it last fall. We elected an African American president, and so those are good trends, and they suggest hope. The question is, given that hope, how much can be achieved in the next 4 and 8 years by the president, given the fact that he's been dug into a hole by the previous administrations and has to face all these immediate crises and has to deal with the day-to-day issues of toxic assets, while hopefully he deals with long-run policy. I want to talk a little about how long-run policy, though, and the policy that we recommended in our Kerner update. We, as the original Kerner Commission, gave first priority to employment and education policy. And we stressed that what we need to do today is target that policy on the middle class and on the working class and on the truly disadvantaged equally, so that they all have a stake in the process, and so that not only do they benefit, but that we have the potential for a political coalition in the future because they have in fact benefited. By employment policy, we mean strengthening the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act, which essentially says that once there is 4% unemployment, a process goes into effect whereby we do something about it. And now I'm not talking about the immediate situation today where employment is so high, but just year to year, decade to decade, whenever unemployment gets above 4%, we should have a Keynesian-like process of countering it. I'm talking about the Employee Free Choice Act. We need to make it easier for people, for employees to join unions. I'm talking about universal health care, which is needed in and of itself for all Americans, but is certainly a policy that strengthens workers and gives them more flexibility in their day-to-day life. I'm talking about new trade policy, which gives more rights to workers, gives workers as much rights as stockholders, and that keeps jobs in America. And most of all, I'm talking about a new employment, training, and creation program that replaces the Workforce Investment Act and TANF that really links training and retraining of the poor, the working class, and middle class to jobs that are in demand wherever they're in demand. And this can be modeled in part on the successful experiences of countries in Europe, like Germany and some of the Scandinavian countries, but also the successful experiences of a number of American organizations and states, like the Center for Employment Training in California. But we need a comprehensive system where if you're out of work, you get trained, retrained, and you get directed to a place where there is a job with upward mobility. Linked to this employment strategy is an education strategy, and we're calling for an Education Equity Act. And the main goal of that act should be to ensure that every kid in every school district across the country has the same amount invested in them as adjusted for local cost of living. Almost I think every industrialized democracy now has such a policy. Regardless of where you live and what school district, the same amount gets invested in you in terms of the teachers and the classroom size and the facilities and the computers and all of what you know better than I is needed. There are states that have made good progress towards a greater equity, states like Connecticut and the state of North Carolina, and we should build on that in what we do. And we should have, as part of an Educational Equity Act, a contract for college where we go back more to a grant system rather than the present loan system. These are just some of the examples that we're talking about that cut across all levels in the country, at least the middle class, the working class, and the poor, and that can help pull them together into a coalition for the future. But we also think that there needs to be a simultaneous, concentrated strategy targeted at the areas of greatest need in our inner cities and for the truly disadvantaged. And here what's really important is to remember that since the Kerner Commission, we've learned a great deal through scientific evaluations and best practices about what doesn't work, and we've learned a great deal about what does work for the inner city.